I'm not going to record here very much. I'll wait until I'm back at the guest house.
अमृतसर के जलियांवाला बाग में मान नरसंहार भारत को आतंकित कर भारतीय राष्ट्रवाद को कुचलने का ऐसा ही एक प्रयास था। हम सुना रहे हैं खून में डूबा क्रूरताओं का इतिहास, वो गोलियां जो मासूमियत को छीन गई। कहने वाला ये न सिख न हिंदू और न मुसलमान था, उस दिन बना जो लहू हिंदुस्तान निकला। और इस दशा में जलियांवाला बाग का सरदार और उससे संबंधित घटनाक्रम का इतिहास।
Behind me there is a sculpture, fairly recent, and turning 180 degrees. Behind me there is the Jallianwala Bagh Memorial Park. Memorial to more than 1,000 unarmed protesters who were murdered by a contingent of soldiers under British command. The protesters were railing against the Rowlatt Act. I'm going to go into this a little later on. But essentially they were peacefully protesting and more than 1,000 people were killed. I'm going to expand once I get back to the guest house, I think, because I don't think I'm going to record that much in here. I'm going to go in now.
Okay, so back in my accommodation now. I must admit that this one has weighed on me quite a lot because, as I mentioned before, this is one of the darkest pages in the British Empire, which is saying a fair bit. Anyway, so a little bit of history before we look at the actual day itself. Now, in April 1919, World War I had been over. The Great War for a matter of just a handful of months. The armistice had been called on the 11th of November 1918. This was less than 5 months later. And because, although we had won the war, we had suffered massively. An entire generation of men wiped out, money, resources, and all the rest. But millions of the citizens of what was then British India, which of course takes into account what is now Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Burma, millions of soldiers, of workers, of helpers and runners and all the rest had fought for us. There had in fact been a couple of nascent uprisings. One was in February 1915. I imagine the Indian, broader Indian people, the soldiers and the workers were going, why are we fighting and dying on European ground for this European war again? Anyway, after the war finished, the Defence of India Act and then the Rowlatt Act were passed. These were massively unpopular because they were massively unfair. Unfair doesn't even cover it. Essentially, to maintain their grip on power, our grip on power, the authorities were granted incredibly broad authority to stop, detain, imprison anyone without trial on any pretext whatsoever if they were suspected of being peripherally involved in any kind of protest or uprising, or if they just heard a rumor, they could imprison, detain in shocking, inhumane conditions and torture people for any reason whatsoever. Of course, that was massively unpopular with decent people, and especially, of course, with Indian people who were actively protesting. This was at a time when Mahatma Gandhi was very, very active and was beginning to have a sense of unity. And his way of non-violence was the way, as far as he was concerned. Not everyone agreed with him. Now, there were gatherings and there were mildly violent uprisings, but by Sikhs, because one of the ways in which the British, as well as every other empire in the history of the world, kept order was to put natives one against the other. In this case, they were worried about Muslim and Hindu unity. And of course, we have the Sikhs as well. Now, orders have been passed down all over India, but in the Punjab in this case, where gatherings were not permitted and they would be fired upon. A very nasty man, at least by my lights and by the lights of most decent people, whose name was Reginald Dyer, who at that time was a brevet brigadier general. He was a colonel temporarily promoted. He was born and raised in British India and was, by all accounts, the stereotype of the stony-faced, stiff upper-lipped British martinet kind of senior officer. And he was in charge of enforcing the Rowlatt Act, but he went incredibly far in some cases. In one very famous case, a British lady had been, I don't know how the veracity of assaulted was. It's entirely possible that she had had something knocked out of her hand in a small crowd, but he set up pickets at either end of a busy street and decreed that any native person who wanted to use the street had to crawl on their bellies the 200 meters or so, because if you can show veneration for the Hindu gods by prostrating yourself upon your belly, you can do the same for a British lady. Nice. Anyway, so this is the history. After World War I, trying to maintain order with increasing subcontinent-wide interest and increasing unity to protest against British rule in non-violent ways, non-compliance, shutting the whole place down by just not working, that kind of stuff. But there were some people who, despite Mahatma's word, were talking about armed uprising, or at least violent uprising. And so we come to the day, 13th of April 1919, in Jallianwala Bagh Park, which is, believe me, it's 100 meters away from the Golden Temple. Now, there was a spectrum of people there, but they were mostly Sikhs. If you look at the names of the martyrs, it's all Singh, you know? There were some other ethnicities, Muslim, Hindu, pilgrims from Afghanistan involved, but it was mostly Sikhs. Amritsar, Golden Temple, and they had gathered in numbers approaching, the estimate is about 2,000. And there was quite a famous man speaking, again talking about the line between violence and armed uprising. And Brigadier General Dyer and his Lieutenant Governor, whose name was O'Dwyer, who was essentially a loyalist and towed the line and was very in favour of all of these rather draconian responses. Essentially you have the park, and it's like a rectangle like this, and the main entrance to this day is here, and you had other small entrances that were the size of a normal doorway, all of which were locked at the time, with 2 armoured cars, both armed with Vickers machine guns, and a contingent of 50-odd men, mostly Gurkhas, armed with a .303 Lee Enfield rifle. So, bolt-action rifles. You had the gathering at the far end, and you had the soldiers walk in, and without much of a word, really. They walk in, they start deploying into lines. The protesters notice them and stand up. And the lines, the soldiers' lines, you have a kneeling rank at the front, a standing rank at the back. And like I say, mostly Gurkhas. The only British Army officers there were Dyer and O'Dwyer, and everyone else was subcontinental, in this case mostly Gurkhas who are Nepalese, and who are notoriously, to this day, loyal and are professional soldiers. No warning was given, no warning shots were given. They just started opening fire at a large group of unarmed men, women, children, old people. And they kept firing, I think the number is 1,650 times, and no one could get out. They couldn't get out. And when the troops had used between a third and half of their total ammunition, estimates vary. The official report says something like 365. Estimates vary, but the modern take is between 1,300 and 1,500 people were killed. Dyer was directing the soldiers to fire on concentrations of people, so where the crowds were thickest, in this case, trying to get out, and was directing how to fire. The aftermath was pretty much the antithesis of what Dyer had wanted. He said to the review panel that was called that he wanted to send a message that would be heard throughout India. He succeeded in that, but not really the way that he had intended. The response to the news of the massacre was mixed. More hardline people were saying, good on them, that'll show them, and all that. But really, when it got back to Britain, I'm not going to go into all of them, but Winston Churchill was then the Secretary of State for War, and he condemned it as unutterably monstrous, a dark stain on the British reputation, that it was murder, or at the very, very least, manslaughter. On the 5th of July, 1920, members of British Parliament voted, I think it was something like 245 to 350, something like that, against Dyer. The inquiry was ineffective and rather lax. Dyer eventually went further out. He did eventually resign, and he died in Somerset. I'm not actually sure at the point of this in April 1919 he had actually ever been to Britain, but because, like I say, he was born and raised in India. Anyway, so the ramifications of this terrible, horrific act was to unify British India. And between 1920 and 1922, Gandhi and his acts of non-violent protest and non-compliance gained in momentum across the board. Now, of course, India didn't gain its independence until 1947, in which time partition happened into Pakistan and Bangladesh and modern Myanmar. But this was when the banks of British authority were flooded, and it was one too many. And it was a very dark day. So, it looks like that was about 13 minutes. This is going to have to, I think I'm going to have to make this into its own video. Please do look up on this stuff on Wikipedia. If any of you have seen the film Gandhi, you've seen it depicted. And if you'll excuse me, I'm now going to go and find someone to have a stiff drink. All right, take care.